Hey everyone, are you looking to get ahead in the world that's constantly evolving? Well, join me because in this video, I'll discuss my top 3 tips for embracing change and thriving in the world of uncertainty. So let's get into it. So tip number 1 is adopting a being orientation. And I might have got this from Brad Sternberg's Master of Change. But essentially, it's about not defining yourself by anything extrinsic, because anything extrinsic, i.e., material things, titles, positions of power, are inherently unstable and impermanent. If you adopt more of a being mindset, focus more on intrinsic things that you can control, then you become much more resilient and in the face of change, and you become much more able to respond to change well. When you let go of extrinsic either possessions or titles or your external image, you basically feel like a huge weight is lifted and you're much less stressed, you're much less reactive and are coming at things from a more response environment. So this way of thinking is extremely ancient, and if you go deep into Buddhism and Stoic philosophy, they talk about it all the time. It's also mentioned in modern religion in terms of the serenity prayer, so allow me to focus on the things that I can control and give me the strength to deal with the things that I can't. It's not anything new, and I would really recommend to cultivate this kind of mindset, focusing a lot on maybe Stoic philosophy is what I've enjoyed the most, so particularly the writings of Ryan Holiday, who's kind of distilled the writings of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius into kind of more understandable modern lessons. But yeah, this is a really interesting approach. I think it's quite hard to explain. I think you've seen a lot of it in the press. There are all sorts of examples of minimalism, people just getting rid of all their physical possessions because people talk about the physical possessions owning them rather than them owning the physical possessions. And the interesting thing about defining yourself by physical possessions is it's kind of transient. They're all transient. They obviously, if it's fashion, if it's particular items of clothing or cars or whatever, they fall out of fashion pretty quickly. So it's much more robust and resilient to define yourself by sort of intrinsic qualities. So I am someone who learns regularly, I am someone who is kind, all the things that are within your control, and it's much more resilient to do that. Interestingly, I started life from this kind of fixed mindset, I'd say, of defining myself extrinsically, and then I eventually had to just let go of it because so much happened over the course of my life that kind of contradicted that self-image that I could no longer hang on to it. And all the while I was hanging on to that extrinsic self-image, I was constantly a bit stressed and a bit, I guess, I was suffering to some extent to hold on to that image. Whereas if I just let go and recognize that, as Carl Rogers would say, I am a complex adaptive system moving through space, accepting inputs through my environment, which gives you a much better understanding of who you are as an individual and enables you to kind of deal with change and things that happen over time in a much more effective way. In terms of my career, I think defining yourself by your skills and your attributes and your beliefs and values is actually a great way to go, rather than a job title or a specific role you've been given. And this happened to me at work. I had joined out of university to be a hedge fund researcher. If I had defined myself by that throughout my whole career, then I would have kind of suffered the things that are out of my control, i.e. hedge fund performance or clients not particularly being interested in hedge funds anymore. All these things are outside of my control. If I'd have stuck to that changes that were happening in the industry, and if I'd stuck to that kind of fixed definition of what my job was, I would have basically died or just not progressed at all. Something that's really important when you're thinking about being orientation is thinking about your values and your skills and how you can apply those to different areas. Reid Hoffman always talks about, in order to build kind of an anti-fragile approach to your career, you should always have a different area. And that's something that I've just done throughout my whole career. So while I joined as a hedge fund researcher, I always had my foot in credit fund research. So when hedge funds fell out of fashion, I was able to lean into credit research. I then started to lean into sustainability as I saw that as a new growing area. And eventually I was able to kind of fully lean into sustainability and move into that area. And that's something Reid Hoffman really recommends in his book, Startup of You. And I think that's really important, to be recognizing that times can change. What you do right now as your kind of core might fall out of favor, or market forces might render that skill set irrelevant. So it's always important to be having your foot or doing something in a kind of adjacent area. And that's something that I've really benefited from in my career, although sometimes it can feel like you're not progressing as fast as you'd like, because if you take a very linear forward trajectory, you can often get somewhere much quicker. But the theory there is that is a bit more of a fragile state. That's always something that worried me. I've always wanted a broad base of experience, so I've taken the more kind of anti-fragile approach, and it's worked out pretty well so far. Tip number 2 is becoming a hyper learner, and I've pinched this from Edward Hess's book, which is called Hyper Learning. He talks about how in this era of rapid rapid technological change and information dissemination through the internet, things are just progressing at a kind of unbelievable rate. And the way to deal with that is to become what he calls a hyper learner. And that is something that I've embraced since I kind of got lost a bit in my career and needed to find something else to do, is the search for that frontier of knowledge in an area. So once you find that kind of periphery of knowledge and stay there, you can actually move ahead of quite a lot of people. Let's think about where most people get information. It's probably school, university, professional qualifications. Most people are just watching TV, which is like entertainment, so not really getting new information. And then I'd just like to talk about like how long it takes for information to get into like curriculums and professional qualifications. And by the time it's made it there, it's pretty much mainstream. So it takes time for knowledge to kind of propagate through the system. So the idea is that if you find the source of that information, then you can kind of stay ahead and learn it first. And that puts you in a huge competitive advantage, because basically you've just got a smaller area of specialist knowledge versus other people. And if you stay on that cutting edge, you'll always be there. And that's why it's so important to be what Hess would call a hyper learner. The amazing thing about this day and age is that most people that are at that cutting edge, you know, the Einsteins of our age, are currently out there. They're writing books. Well, books have always been there, but they're writing books. Like, think of when The Origin of Species came out, for example. You could have read that and when it was published and just mind blown, right? By reading books, staying on the cutting edge of books, but also now you've got podcasts, you've got YouTube. People are putting out content like direct from the mouth of people that are actually in the industry doing what you potentially want to do or what you want to learn. That gives you a huge competitive advantage if you embrace that, because a lot of people, I think, haven't realized that. So that's definitely how I got into sustainability. So all through my traditional education, school, university, professional qualifications, and then even learning on the job, like climate change or sustainability wasn't mentioned at all, really. And it wasn't until basically the ESG CFA, as soon as it came out, that I found this knowledge. I think reading around the subject as well, it just makes you realize that sustainability is everything now, and it's going to need to be everything, because we're facing several impending disasters and things have changed since the syllabuses were written at school. So, and that gave me the opportunity to move into a new area with very limited competition. I talk back to, instead of competing directly, just keep evolving until you have no competition. That can put you in great stead for your career or moving into the future. So if you're constantly learning, these changes that potentially threatening you are no longer a surprise. You've already digested them, planned for them, and potentially maneuvered for them to take advantage of them. So in addition to sustainability, I think another one was, crypto, which has clearly taken off again. If you were a first mover in that, that could have been a huge better advantage for you. So when you're looking at understanding change, it's just so important to take a really wide aperture of information, and I think that's to kind of protect you against the fact that the change that you're anticipating is potentially wrong. Lots of very smart people who have done really well at navigating change over the years, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, they talk about using multiple models. So I think lots of people use one mental model generally, which is their experience, but then there's also the mental model of education, so things that you've read about, things that you might not necessarily have experienced but other people have and they've shared it. The more kind of mental models you have, the better picture of reality you have, so the better understanding of how and where things are changing is. And that means, again, you can position for them and adapt and potentially benefit from them. Another great book talking about mental models and this kind of idea of continuous learning is Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, and he talks about it more from a corporate angle. It's this idea of individuals within the corporation being ultra flexible learners, not defined by anything extrinsically, which enables them to adapt and change quickly to benefit from new market trends. And the third tip is, adapting to that efficiently. And this leads me to probably one of my favorite topics at the moment, which is allostasis. So the idea of how a complex adaptive system adapts to a new environment or a change. And that's basically done in several stages. So you essentially recognize the change, try and kind of factor it into your current being, maybe with a bit. And if that doesn't work because there's not space, then you maybe stretch a bit to try and incorporate it and hope that it can be kind of absorbed going forward. But if that doesn't happen, then you basically have to evolve and adapt and move on. And that essentially means you need to drop something out. The idea of unlearning comes in from, and Barry O'Reilly has written a book about this. So the idea that you need to kind of stop doing things so that you can relearn and progress into the future. So an example of this from my career is when I moved into sustainable investment and I had to stop doing something because I wasn't able to fit it into my current schedule. So I stopped doing the hedge fund research. I liked hedge fund research. I didn't really want to stop talking to hedge fund managers all the time because I found it really interesting, but it was something that I had to give up to make room for the new thing and the growth in my career. So an example of reaching the final stage of allostasis there, I couldn't just absorb it. You can think about this in terms of beliefs as well. So you kind of have your current belief set, which is your idea of how the world works, how things work, and then suddenly something can come along that can challenge that belief set. So I think about, incorporate sustainable investment, how we have to incorporate carbon emissions now into our investments. As I mentioned all through my career, I never had to think about that. It wasn't mentioned at all, but now it is. If your prior belief is that carbon emissions are irrelevant for investment, then that's something that could directly conflict with this new information. And so that belief has to go, really. Otherwise, you can hunker down on your belief set, not change. As Brad Sternberg says, if you don't evolve and change, then you'll die, because you're not going to change the world. It's really important in terms of beliefs as well. And then on the personal front, about a year ago, I had a baby. Prior to that, I was doing a huge amount of cycling, and I realized that when the baby turned up, my priorities had changed. This was obviously a massive change in my life. So following the process of allostasis, could I incorporate my old cycling regime with the baby? And that was an absolute no. Even could I flex my schedule to try and make room for both, borrow time maybe from spending time with the baby? Absolutely not. I was not prepared to do that as well. So something had to go, and it was the cycling that had to drop out. So I've adapted to my new self because I haven't tied my sense of self to my cycling ability. That was fine. Didn't care. I do have some bikes now that are a bit redundant. So maybe it's an example of how times move on. You perhaps shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. I rapidly learned about what it means to be a good dad, and that made me realize that I probably needed to be present all the time and couldn't just go carry on cycling. I wanted to be a present dad, so that allowed me to understand what I needed to do and adapt to this change. Hope you enjoyed this video. They were my 3 top tips for thriving in a world of constant change. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out this one over here.